What's up everyone, Gabe Productions here. So today I have a brand new keyboard in front of me, and don't worry, I've read your comments on my previous keyboard review and I promise that you will hear how this keyboard sounds later on. But before we get to that, let's first introduce this keyboard. So this is a keyboard that many of you, probably me included, have never heard before, and it's by a company called DrunkDeer. Yeah, interesting choice of name for a keyboard company, but they're basically, I guess, a startup company, a new entrant into the keyboard space, and this is their first ever keyboard. So, can they challenge the competition with this keyboard? And who is this keyboard even for? Well, let's get into what this keyboard is. So, this is the DrunkDeer A75 magnetic switch keyboard, and that's right, it isn't a mechanical keyboard. Well, at least in the traditional sense of how a mechanical switch would register actuations, but these switches are actually technically mechanical in feel and build, but they don't actuate the same as mechanical switches. So what are magnetic switches? Well, to be honest, I have absolutely no idea what magnetic switches were before DrunkDeer reached out to me and took a chance on me to review this keyboard. As someone who is an extremely tiny, non-existent YouTuber, I'm glad that they did choose to take a chance on me. So props to DrunkDeer for taking that chance. But after reading about magnetic switches from their website, according to DrunkDeer, magnetic switches are essentially Hall effect sensors, which determine the distance of the key switch when it is pressed through measuring the strength of the magnetic field in the switch. Now, I'm no expert in what all of that really means and what Hall effect sensors are, but a quick Google search would tell you that it's about the same thing. What I do know is that Hall effect sensors are more common in things like joysticks as an alternative to analog joysticks. Now, because they use Hall effect to measure actuation instead of a physical contact like in a traditional mechanical switch, or the breaking of a light beam in a more modern optical switch, Hall effect switches similar to optical switches last a lot longer than traditional mechanical switches, where the physical contacts can wear over time. In fact, because there are technically no parts that can wear over time in this keyboard, not even a light beam like in an optical switch, which may fail eventually, this key switch can technically last forever. But of course, nothing lasts forever. There is still wear and tear in terms of the switch itself, and DrunkDeer did state that the switches can be pressed millions of times but not infinitely. Another advantage of these magnetic switches over mechanical and optical switches are that because they are Hall effect, which is the measurement of the strength of the magnetic field in the switch, the actuation point in the switch can actually be customized. DrunkDeer lets you do this by selecting 9 levels of actuation depth on the keyboard. The actuation can be as little as 0.4mm to 3.6mm, which is almost the full keystroke. Now that is really cool, and if you're like me, someone who basically accidentally taps other switches while typing or even double taps by accident, then you may want to set the actuation point a little deeper. I found that the default, I don't really know what the default point is, I'm guessing it's about a level 4 or 5, was a sweet spot for me. So how do you change it? Well, basically, all you have to do is press function 2, which is an interesting key on this keyboard. I've not seen a function 2 key before, but basically you press and hold down function 2, and then you press any from 1 to 9, 1 being the least amount of travel and 9 being the most amount of travel. But we must talk about a downside, or at least a potential downside that I can see at the moment. Since these are still in a way mechanical switches, they are a specific type of mechanical switch. They are linear switches, or basically the more commonly known reed switches. Now, I'm personally not a fan of reed switches, and there isn't an option for alternative switches on DrunkDeer's website at the moment, and I think I kind of know why. It's certainly not because you can't do it with magnetic switches, but it's because you probably don't really need to. By using non-linear switches like brown or blue switches where you have a tactile feeling or a click, you have to fix an actuation point, which is probably at the clicking point, because it wouldn't really make sense to set the actuation before or after the click. That means that you do lose one of the biggest points of these magnetic switches, and that is the customizable actuation point. So until someone can think about how to make an adjustable click for non-linear switches, which is technically impossible, it wouldn't make too much sense to use magnetic switches for, say, a brown switch keyboard. But I don't really think that that's completely the case, and I think that DrunkDeer should still make non-linear switches for the keyboard. And that's my first feedback to DrunkDeer. Also, that is right. Even though DrunkDeer did give me this keyboard to review for free, I made it clear to them that I was going to be completely honest with this review and transparent in my thoughts. And so here's my first feedback. DrunkDeer should definitely make a brown or and blue switch keyboard. Now this is because if what DrunkDeer says is true in terms of the durability aspect of the millions of keystrokes that a magnetic switch can do, that is still a vast improvement over the durability of traditional mechanical switches, and on par if not technically still better than optical switches. So there is still a benefit there in terms of durability. You may lose the customizability, but at least you still gain in terms of other things like the durability, at least supposedly. Also, DrunkDeer states that the response speed of this keyboard is 10 times faster than a traditional mechanical keyboard. So DrunkDeer, that is very vague, and I'm not exactly sure what 10 times faster even mean. Does that mean in latency? Because most good mechanical keyboards probably have a low enough latency that 10 times faster than that is probably not really possible. Maybe they're comparing to some cheap membrane keyboard. I'm not sure, but either way, I did not really feel any latency when I'm typing this keyboard or in gaming, so it should be up there with most of the high-end keyboards. Also, as you can see, the keyboard is wired, so latency should be as good as it can possibly be as well. And unfortunately, I'm not the LTT Labs, and so I can't test that for you, so sorry about that. But now that I've mentioned it, yes, the keyboard is wired as I've said. There is no wireless version of the A75 at the moment, but at least it uses a removable USB-C to C cable, which is provided in the box. This means that latency should technically, as I mentioned, be lower than that of a wireless keyboard, although there are chances and occasions when a wired keyboard can have higher latency than a wireless keyboard. Also, DrunkDeer does provide a full-sized USB adapter in the box in case you want to connect the keyboard to a computer that only has USB-A ports, which is nice. So while it would have been nice for this keyboard to be wireless, I will accept it being wireless because of its removable cable. And yeah, alright, so this review is kind of all over the place at the moment because I realized that I haven't gone over the unboxing and the specs. So let's rewind back to the unboxing first. When you open the box of the keyboard, you are immediately greeted with the A75 itself, and below that, well, not underneath the keyboard, but below the keyboard, are where you find the accessories including a keycap remover, the USB-C to C cable with the USB-A adapter attached, which is nice, and your extra keycaps for Windows because the Mac keys come pre-installed. So that's about all you get in the box, and not even a paper manual, which is completely fine by me because you can find a digital copy on their website. So a simple unboxing with decent foam protection and not really any complaints there. Now let's go over the specs of this keyboard. So as the name would suggest, this is a 75% layout keyboard, which isn't really my favorite layout. My personal preference is an 80% layout keyboard, but 75% is also alright, I guess. You already know that they are magnetic linear switches. It has RGB with 18 types of RGB modes and different color options depending on the mode. So technically there are more than 18, but some modes don't really have a color changing mode. There's an aluminum knob up here which is meant to control volume and play and pause. There is also a sound absorbing foam and bottom pad, and apparently a high quality aluminum plate in the board, although it isn't on the outside because the whole keyboard is covered in a plastic casing, as you can hear, which I'm not really a fan of. I wish they had a metal casing instead, or maybe what Keychron does with their aluminum rails. Oh, and it has a single level adjustable feet, which is not ideal. I mean, at its lowest position, it is really quite decently inclined, which is nice, I guess. But at its most inclined position with the feet, it gets pretty steep, and you probably might want to use a palm rest with this keyboard because the bottom here is also a bit high. So I do wish that maybe for their next iteration of keyboard, they can provide one with adjustable feet such that there is maybe half the height, because this is pretty steep at the moment. One last spec, which I thought was pretty interesting, but for some reason, DrunkDeer hid that all the way at the bottom of the product page, was its IP66 water and dust resistance. And you know I'll definitely be testing that, or you'll be seeing that test later on in this video. The keyboard is also only available in black and white, and DrunkDeer was nice enough to ask me which color I preferred, and so they sent me over a black one because I asked. So thanks, DrunkDeer. Right, with all that out of the way, what are my thoughts and review of this keyboard after using it for about a week? So on top of all the rambling that I did at the start of the video about magnetic switches and how cool I think they are and how DrunkDeer should have more options and stuff like that, I think that for a linear switch keyboard, which isn't my preference by the way, I do like tactile and clicky feeling keyboards more. I think that the keyboard is overall really nice to type on, despite being made of mostly plastic with the exception of the volume knob up here. The keyboard still feels really solid and has good weight to it, and there is definitely no flex, probably partially because of how thick this keyboard actually is. And overall, it felt like a quality plastic cased keyboard. Well, I would also have liked to see it being wireless as mentioned. Wired is fine because of that removable USB-C cable. Overall, all the switches felt even, and I honestly really like of these switches and how they bottom out. I'm not sure if it's because of the foam, but they all sound really good, especially the thonk of the spacebar. That's a pretty solid thonk. I'm not sure if that thonk sound or the general, I'll say mellow sound of the keyboard is because of the foam that they include at the bottom of the keyboard, but basically the switches all sound really good. And so, as promised, here's the part where you listen to me type on this keyboard. Enjoy. Overall, the typing on this is great, and despite the fact that, as I've mentioned, I'm a fan of brown and blue switches instead, again, the fact that you can also adjust the actuation depth of this keyboard makes this a keyboard for anyone who likes red or linear switches. I like the RGB setting on this keyboard as well, as there is quite a lot of customization. You can set it to white if you want by selecting the fixed color mode and then cycling through the colors to get to white. Alright, and that brings me to software. So like many keyboards, the software built into this keyboard is quite alright. Not too many levels of customization, but you can do things like change the actuation levels, and all you have to do is press the function 2 key and cycle from 1 to 9. You can also change the operating layout of this keyboard between macOS and Windows OS, which is great. So yeah, overall the built-in software is quite decent. One thing that does annoy me a bit, and I wish that maybe DrunkDeer can look into this, is how you change the brightness of the backlighting. So instead of having the ability to just press and hold down the brightening and dimming key to change the brightness, you actually do have to spam the key in order to go from off to full brightness and vice versa. So if I just hold down the dimming key, it only went down one level of brightness. I have to actually spam the key all the way to turn it off, or if I want to turn it all the way on, I can't just press it once. I have to spam the key to get it to full brightness. So I hope that DrunkDeer can maybe change something in the future such that the future keyboards will not, you don't have to spam the key just to change brightness, and you can actually hold it down. Right, so let's talk about the typing experience of this keyboard. Not just the feel, but the typing experience. Now, I already did mention that the general typing experience are fine, and it still stands. It's pretty great. They are overall nice to type on, despite being my least favorite kind of switches. But I guess to add on, the force required to press the keys are good. I would say that they are a little on the heavier side than I expected, but that could be due to me just not being used to linear switches. I couldn't find any specs of how much force was required to press down on these keys, but overall, I guess the good thing is that they all felt consistent, as mechanical switches should. On top of that, testing the keyboard on the key rollover website, I'm happy to report that this keyboard has more than 10 key rollover, and it could register so many keys at once that I have honestly no idea how many key rollover this keyboard has, if it even has a limit at all. So good job on DrunkDeer for that. Now for a not so scientific test, I did a typing test of this keyboard against my Keychron Key 8, which are brown switches. brown optical switches if you want to know even more, and my Razer Blade 14 3 times each, taking the average of 3 scores of each keyboard. And surprisingly, I scored the highest with the Razer Blade 14 keyboard, followed by the K8 and then the A75. Now, this isn't so much a test of the keyboards, but rather the style of the switches they use, because they all use 3 different switch styles. I honestly feel like I can always type fastest on a laptop keyboard due to their more cramped layout, which is actually beneficial to me, and the lower travel time required, which also allows me to just type faster in general. Next, brown and blue switches are the go-to for me when it comes to typing because of how comfortable they are and the reassuring clicks, which help to tell you that you have actually actuated a key, unlike more linear switches. But that is also no surprise, since these tactile and clicky switches are aimed towards typists more than they are to gamers, while linear switches like this on the A75 are definitely more inclined towards gamers than typists. And lastly, the linear switches on the A75 came in last, but still with a very respectable score, which if anything says that this keyboard is still pretty good for typing, and if you're probably like me, just need some time to get used to. Of course, as someone who types essays and does some gaming, I would personally pick a brown switch or blue switch keyboard any day over linear switches like this one. But as we all know, typing is just one side of the story. While these linear magnetic switches can't beat tactile and clicky switches in my opinion, where they do shine, as I mentioned, is probably in gaming. It is well known that many esports players prefer linear switches over clicky ones, and that's because of the responsiveness and the feel that you get from linear switches compared to blue and brown switches, which technically need more time between clicks compared to linear switches, where you can just press halfway, because blue and brown switches do have a click where you do have to click it in and then you have to let go, whereas if you can set this keyboard to maybe 0.4 millimeters of travel, you probably only do have to do a light tap just to actuate the key, which makes using this keyboard technically much faster than brown and blue switch keyboards. And so this is also why these magnetic switches are better than your old traditional mechanical red switches, because you can set the actuation down all the way to 0.4, or you can increase it if you feel like you need a bit more travel. So in gaming like first person shooters, or basically any game for that matter, you can move more responsively, use equipment and stuff faster than if you're using traditional linear mechanical keyboards with a fixed actuation depth, or a clicky and tactile keyboard. Lastly, shout out to the volume knob. It is aluminum, is the only piece of metal that you can kind of feel on the outside of this keyboard. It has a nice twisting feel and a pretty solid thonk when you press it down. Now, I don't want to talk too much about keyquans since this is a review of the DrunkDeer keyboard, but just as a passing mention, the K8's palm rest is quite perfect for this keyboard, if not ever slightly so tall, and also a bit long since it is an 80% layout palm rest. But if you are in the market for a palm rest for this keyboard, you can basically find one that is approximately the same height, if not maybe a bit shorter than the K8's palm rest, and also a 75% layout palm rest at approximately the K8's palm rest height. So the last thing to test for this keyboard is the interesting claim that DrunkDeer has on their website. And that's right, this keyboard is supposedly IP66 water and dust resistant. So it has a 6 for dust resistant, which is the highest kind of dust resistant, but I'm not really sure in what way is this keyboard dust resistant, because dust can still definitely get between the keys. Maybe it's just dust resistance in terms of not getting into the chassis and onto the motherboard, but I'm not very sure. It also has a 6 for water resistance, which means that it should technically be protected against high pressure water jets from any direction. But since it is not a 7, it means that it technically isn't submersible in water. But with that being said, I didn't pay for this, so I tested it with a tap to see if it will still work afterwards. And after pretty much giving this keyboard a bath, I did wait for the USB-C port to dry out first before plugging it in, and it still works and when turned on. Then I went on to test every single key on this keyboard, and they all actually still work, except for the volume knob. For some reason, when I connected it to my Mac, it didn't seem to be very responsive, but when I did plug it into a Windows computer, it seemed fine, so maybe that's just a bit more software side. Now, I can't speak for the longevity. Maybe water did get into the chassis and the motherboard might slowly be failing, who knows. but just that quick wash, and you can even still see a bit of water maybe between the keycaps. They still work fine as of now, so I hope that the IP66 rating does hold true down the road as well. Okay, so I thought that maybe I give you guys a bit of an update on the whole water resistance thing. It seems like there has been some level of water damage inside the keyboard, most notably on the shift key, where the shift key itself still works, but the lighting is gone. The volume knob still adjusts volume, it still plays and pause. As you can see from a few of the keys over here, mainly maybe from the function 6 to the function 8, and the 6 key to the 8 key, it seems like the lighting has also been kind of short-circuited inside, such that they no longer show the right colors. They are showing the wrong colors. As you can see, I set it to white, but they are not showing white. The function 6 does look a bit white, but I don't think it's white either, and the 7 is also gone, and the 8 is currently red. So that's just an update on the water resistance. Also, when I did plug it into my Razer Blade 14 on the Windows side, it kind of just didn't work at all. The lights were kind of going crazy, they were flashing, and I couldn't type out any single letter or any function in the keyboard when I've had it plugged into my Windows laptop. So I'm not sure if it's permanently damaged on that side, but that's kind of weird because that's kind of software. Anyways, I wouldn't recommend running this keyboard under any water, even though it is supposedly IP66 water and dust resistant in terms of strong water jets from any direction. But that should not also be a deal breaker in buying this keyboard, because most keyboards out there anyways are not water resistant or ingress protection protected at all. So if this was water resistant to any degree, that would have been a big bonus, especially regarding the price point. But even if it wasn't, and it clearly isn't for my keyboard, it shouldn't be a deal breaker for you as well. So just keep that in mind. This is still a fantastic keyboard overall. Back to the review. Now, before I give my final thoughts and conclusions, I do want to point out that there is apparently a software or program that you can install on your Mac or Windows to fully customize this keyboard. But I couldn't find it anywhere, and I was also a bit too lazy to ask, so I'll just assume that it isn't out yet and that it will definitely be a plus once it's out and if it works. That being said, overall at a retail price of $149 US and $129.99 US, or basically $123 US as of writing this video, this is not a cheap keyboard, and you can definitely find many other established options at this price or lower. However, what this keyboard has that I have yet to be able to find elsewhere are those magnetic switches, and while I can't verify that they are what DrunkDeer says they are, at face value and accepting that they are magnetic switches and they do what DrunkDeer says they do, it's still a pretty competitive price. And from a consumer standpoint, if they meet their claims in terms of durability and the benefits that Hall effect switches can have on keyboards, then I would say that it wouldn't be a bad thing to support DrunkDeer and help them grow so that they can provide more options down the road. And I would also really like to see a brown and blue switch, as I mentioned, also a wireless version with more premium materials as well. With all that being said though, thank you once again DrunkDeer for taking a chance on a tiny YouTuber like me and for sending me this keyboard to test. And once again, I gave no prior review sample or script to DrunkDeer, and they are seeing this video for the first time at the exact same time as you. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.